The first scream cut through the ballpark louder than the sirens. Mike Lawson was halfway up section 327, a mop handle still in his hand, when the stadium lights flickered and died. For a single, breathless second, 40,000 people froze under the dark skeleton of Riverfront Field. Then smoke began to snake out from the concourse below, gray and oily, and the crowd turned into a living stampede. The big screens went black. The exit signs along the upper deck sputtered, then went out. Someone near Mike yelled, "The doors won't open!" He heard children crying. A woman was pounding on a locked gate with her fists. "Maintenance, get the hell out of the way," the head of security barked, shoving past him, radio hissing useless static. Down on the field, players were already sprinting for the dugouts. Up here in the cheap seats, people were pressing toward the narrow stairs, bodies jammed shoulder to shoulder, one bad shove away from a crush. Mike felt the old training kick in like muscle memory. His eyes swept the section. He saw the choke points, the dead signs, the panicked ushers looking to anyone who seemed like they knew what to do. This upper deck is a trap, the VP of Operations had once bragged over a PowerPoint. Without the right flow plan, you're cooked. Mike dropped the mop. "Everyone listen to me," he shouted, voice tearing his throat. "Row by row. You with the blue cap block that aisle. Nobody moves until I say so." A teenage usher stared at him. "Sir, you can't." "I can," Mike snapped. "Because I wrote the damn evacuation plan for this place years before your boss stole it and slapped his name on it. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world." Mike Lawson was 39 years old, and most days the world thought he was just the guy who unclogged toilets after the 7th inning stretch. By 3 in the afternoon, he'd pull on his faded navy polo with Riverfront Field Operations, stitched over the pocket kiss, his teenage daughter on the top of the head, and drive his beat-up pickup along the Monongahela toward downtown Pittsburgh. The stadium rose out of the old steel district like something from another world, glass LED billboards, a sea of clean concrete where smokestacks used to be. His job title was Night Facilities Technician. In plain English, that meant if it leaked, buzzed, rattled, or stank after dark, Mike was the one who fixed it. He patched pipes, reset breakers, and made sure the beer taps worked better than some marriages. What nobody saw when he hauled trash bags or pushed a floor scrubber was the way his eyes mapped every exit, every stairwell, every choke point in the building. 10 years back, before everything went sideways, Mike had been a fire protection engineer. He'd spent his 20s designing evacuation routes for arenas and airports, obsessed with one simple idea: when things go wrong, people deserve a fighting chance to get out alive. Then came the highway pileup that took his wife the licensing board hearing that blamed him for a corporate shortcut he'd tried to stop, and the partner who'd walked away with his name off their plans and a promotion in his pocket. Mike lost his license, his company, and most of his savings in the same brutal year. What he didn't lose was his stubborn streak, or the way his gut twisted any time he walked into a crowded space with bad exits. At home, it was just him and Emma, now a 15-year-old with her mother's green eyes and a stack of college brochures she didn't think he saw. She knew he used to be some kind of engineer, but to her he was just Dad. The guy who made grilled cheese at midnight and showed up at every school concert even after double shifts. The new VP of Operations at Riverfront, a 30-year-old in slim-fit suits named Bryce Kincaid, barely bothered to learn Mike's name. To Bryce, the world was an Excel sheet and a branding deck. Blue-collar guys were head count, not people. He'd pat Mike on the shoulder sometimes and say things like, "Appreciate you keeping the pipes from exploding, buddy," before striding off to another meeting. One Tuesday evening in May, Mike was swapping out a flickering light panel outside the executive suites when he heard laughter through an open door. On a massive screen, an animated crowd moved through a digital stadium, little dots flowing in perfect lines to glowing exits. And this, Bryce was saying to a row of owners and city officials, is our patented rush flow evac system. My design. Cuts evacuation time in the upper deck by 40%. It's the future of fan safety. Mike's hand went still on the screwdriver. He knew that pattern. The staggered release of rows, the cross-aisle holding zones, the relief channels at the corners. You never forget the first thing you poured your whole heart into. He stepped closer, heartbeat in his ears, watching the arrows dance on the screen. They traced the exact same paths he'd drawn on a kitchen table a decade ago, while his wife fell asleep over grant applications. That was the moment the past stopped being something he tried to forget and became something he couldn't ignore anymore. Bryce's voice still echoed in Mike's head the next afternoon as he pushed his cart through the underbelly of Riverfront Field. The stadium hummed with pre-game energy vendors checking coolers, interns jogging with clipboards, the distant thump of bass as sound crews ran tests, but none of it reached him. Every corner he rounded felt like a reminder of what he'd once built and what someone else now claimed as their genius. He kept telling himself it didn't matter. Titles didn't matter. Credit didn't matter. Not anymore. But the image of that animated crowd flowing through exits, the exact choreography he'd fought for a decade ago, wouldn't let him breathe right. At 5 o'clock sharp, Bryce came striding down the maintenance hallway, trailed by 2 junior executives in matching windbreakers. They talked loudly, as if the concrete walls needed to hear their brilliance. "There he is," Bryce said, spotting Mike like a man spotting a loose bolt in a tire. "Lawson, we need that HVAC reset done within the hour. VIP suite says it's too warm." "It's already done," Mike replied, keeping his tone respectful. Bryce blinked, then turned to his assistants with a smirk. "See? That's what I like. Good help. Who knows their place?" One of the junior execs snickered, and Mike felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck. He swallowed it down. "You also missed a panel," Bryce added, pointing at a ceiling tile that was half an inch off center. "I'll need you to handle that before gates open. Looks sloppy." Mike paused, glanced at the tile, then back at Bryce. "That's a contractor's section. Not mine." Bryce exhaled dramatically. "And do you think fans care whose job it is? They just see a bad product? Come on, man, don't make me explain simple optics." The assistants nodded eagerly like bobbleheads. Mike forced a breath through his nose. "I'll take care of it." "Great," Bryce said, already walking away. "And hey, try to stay out of the executive level tonight, all right? We've got owners in the building and I don't want them tripping over cleaning carts." The hallway fell quiet after they left. Mike leaned both hands against his cart, bracing himself. He'd worked blue-collar jobs for years, swallowed pride for years, but this was a different kind of sting. Not because someone talked down to him, but because he recognized the blueprint of the disrespect. Someone building a tower on top of someone else's buried work. Someone taking credit. Someone assuming no one would ever know the difference. He stayed bent over for a moment before pushing off the cart and moving on. He had work to do. When he clocked out early enough to catch Emma's choir performance, he splashed water on his face in the locker room sink. He didn't want his daughter seeing even a shadow of the heaviness he carried today. The school auditorium still smelled like fresh paint and crayons, even though Emma was in high school now. She spotted him from the stage, and her whole expression lit up. That smile alone made the day's bruises worth it. After the performance, she bounded over, still holding her music folder. "You made it," Wouldn't miss it, he said, ruffling her hair. It still amazed him how she'd grown into a young woman almost overnight. Can we get ice cream? She asked. Sure, he said. My treat. She grinned, looped her arm through his, and for a moment, everything felt right. But halfway through their strawberry sundaes, she grew quiet, studying him with those observant green eyes that had always seen more than he liked. Dad, did something happen at work today? Mike's spoon paused mid-air. He swallowed. What makes you say that? You have that look, she said gently. The one where you're thinking ideas too hard. He tried to laugh it off. Thinking ideas too hard, is that a medical condition? She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. You only get that look when something's really bothering you. Mike set the spoon down. He hated lying to her, but he also hated the idea of burdening a kid who already carried too much loss. It's nothing you need to worry about, he said softly. Just work stuff. She held his gaze. But you matter there. You work so hard. They should know that. He smiled through the ache. She had no idea how close her words landed to something raw inside him. I'm okay, he said. Really. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. When he drove her home, she leaned her head against the truck window, watching the city blur by. Mike focused on the road, mind spinning, stomach tight. The next 2 days at the stadium felt like walking upstream in a river of disrespect. On Wednesday afternoon, he was tightening bolts on a loose railing when an executive he barely recognized approached with a rehearsed smile. Hey buddy, Bryce said you've been wandering around restricted levels. Let's keep you in your zone, all right? Don't need you tripping an alarm or something. Mike had been there because he was asked to fix a light fixture. But arguing wouldn't change a thing, so he nodded and went back to work. On Thursday morning, an email blast went out to all operations staff reminding them to adhere to approved movement patterns and avoid unsupervised presence in executive zones. It didn't mention Mike's name, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. And by Thursday night, while restocking paper towels in the men's room, Mike overheard 2 ushers in their 20s whispering, Did you hear about Lawson Bryce says he's been poking around security routes like he's some kind of expert? Man, he's just a janitor. Why would he mess with that stuff? Mike set the towels down gently, pretending not to hear. Each small cut hurt more because he'd spent his life preventing the kind of disasters that could break a stadium wide open. He could map Riverfront Field blindfolded, knew which corners funneled crowds too tight, which exits jammed first, which alarm circuits were outdated. He'd warned his old company about issues like these before warnings that were ignored until the consequences fell on him. Now he felt the old pressure rising again, like being trapped in the wrong end of a funnel with no way out. By Friday afternoon, tension in the stadium was different. Thin. Nervous. A severe thunderstorm warning blared across local radios. Dark clouds crowded the horizon. The meteorologists talked about sudden wind bursts, lightning strikes, the potential for power issues. Bryce called an emergency operations huddle in the executive conference room. Mike wasn't invited, of course, but as he walked past the glass doors, he heard Bryce's voice floating out. We'll be fine. The system can handle a shutdown even if the power flickers. Everyone just stick to the protocol. Mike paused mid-step. Protocol. The same protocol Bryce had stolen and repackaged. The same one Mike had designed for a different stadium. Entirely. A stadium with wider ramps, different choke points, better structural ventilation. He kept walking before anyone noticed him listening. But the sick feeling in his stomach wouldn't let up. He finished his shift early and made it home just before the rain hit. Emma was on the couch doing homework, her hair twisted into a messy bun. You're home early, she said, surprised. Storm's getting bad, he replied, dropping into the armchair. They'll probably call me in later if something shorts. Emma hesitated, then closed her math book. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you let people treat you like you're less? You're not. I know you're not. He stared at her, stunned by the quiet honesty of her question. People don't treat me like that, he tried. Yes, they do. Her voice cracked a little. And I hate it. Mike's throat tightened. He sat forward, hands clasped. I stay quiet, he said slowly, choosing the words carefully, not because I think I'm less, but because sometimes speaking up costs more than it fixes. And I can't afford to lose this job. Emma looked down at her hands. I just wish they could see what I see. He reached over and squeezed her hand. I'm okay, kiddo. Really. But the truth sat heavy in his chest for the rest of the night. The storm worsened. At 8:20 p.m., Mike's phone buzzed. He already knew who it would be. Bryce Work Power Flicker in Section A. Need you ASAP. Mike stared at the message. Then he grabbed his keys. Riverfront Field was a lattice of rain and flashing lights when he arrived. Wind pushed the stadium flags flat against their poles. Security guards hurried people inside for shelter. The air tasted metallic the way it does when lightning is too close. Inside the operations tunnel, Bryce stood with a walkie-talkie barking orders. Lawson. Took you long enough. Mike wiped rain from his face. Traffic's hell right now. Whatever. We've got intermittent power drops on the upper deck. I need you to check the circuit panel by the west stair tower. Mike's heart lurched. The west stair tower was one of the worst bottleneck points in the stadium. It was where he'd begged his old company to redesign the exit strategy. It was also where Bryce had copied his old plan and slapped on the rush flow label. Is anyone up there? Mike asked. A few vendors setting up, Bryce said. Don't worry, it's not game night. Mike hesitated. Something didn't feel right. Lightning's close, he warned. If that panel got water in it, just do it, Bryce snapped. I'm not playing hero tonight. Mike bit his tongue and headed up the stairs. The wind howled through the open concourse like a living thing. The west tower lights flickered in a way that made his skin crawl. He reached the circuit cabinet, pulled a flashlight from his belt, and opened the metal door. The inside was damp. Not soaked, but damp is enough when you're dealing with high-voltage arrays. He leaned in, flashlight steadied, breath tight. Then he saw it. A scorch mark. Tiny. Fresh. A sign of an arc flash waiting for a second chance to become something bigger. His heart kicked hard. He reached for the radio clipped to his belt. Operations, this is Lawson. You need to shut down the West Tower feeds immediately. There's water intrusion. The radio crackled, then died. He tried again. Nothing. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Thunder slammed overhead, shaking the concrete under his boots. In the pitch darkness, Mike exhaled slowly, forcing down the surge of adrenaline. The storm was worsening. The tower was dark. Power was unstable. And nobody could hear him. Somewhere below, he heard shouting. A panicked voice. Then another. The sound of running footsteps. Mike leaned over the railing and saw shapes moving in the stairwell. People, maybe vendors, possibly security, stumbling in the dark as the emergency lights failed to kick on. The West Tower's emergency lights should have activated instantly, but they didn't. Which meant one thing. The system Bryce had sworn was foolproof wasn't working. Mike's hands tightened around the railing. The pressure he'd been swallowing for days, weeks, years clenched inside him like a fist. People were in the dark. People were scared. And everything in this stadium was wired wrong. He turned back to the cabinet, lightning illuminating the concourse for a fraction of a second. He saw exactly what he feared. A short path leading straight into the emergency line. If the wrong surge hit, he closed his eyes. Something was coming. Something big. And he was the only one who understood how bad it could get. Lightning cracked so close it rattled the steel frame of the tower. The west concourse lay in total darkness, carved only by the quick white bursts flashing through the storm clouds outside. From below, the shouts grew louder, raw fear echoing up the concrete spine of the stadium. Mike steadied his breath, letting his eyes adjust. He knew this place better than the people who designed it. He could picture the stairwell's shape, the narrow turns, the blind edge at the landing where panicked feet would slip if they tried to move too fast. And he could picture something else, a surge hitting that soaked panel, traveling the wrong line, turning the entire stair tower into an electrified trap. He bent over the cabinet again. Flashlight clenched between his teeth. The smell of burning insulation tickled the back of his throat. A tiny arc flickered near the lower fuse bank, an involuntary spark that shouldn't have been possible with the emergency line isolated, unless someone had rerouted those lines for streamlined efficiency. Bryce. That slick handprint was all over this mess. Another scream rose from below. Mike shut his eyes for half a second. He saw Emma's face the way she'd looked at him in the ice cream shop, hurt, worried, seeing through the mask he'd worn too long. He heard the question she'd asked just yesterday. Why do you let people treat you like you're less? This was the moment. Not for dignity, not for pride, but because people were in danger, and he knew exactly what would happen if he didn't move right now like the man he used to be. He yanked off his glove, reached into the cabinet, and twisted the primary breaker hard to the left. Sparks ripped across the metal. The flash lit the tower like a camera bulb. His hand stung, but he kept going, shutting down every feed except the emergency generators, hoping to isolate the faulty line long enough to prevent a full blowout. The panel hissed. A sizzle climbed up the wires. For a terrifying heartbeat, he thought the whole array might explode in his face. But the noise faded. The sparks died. Still dark. Still dangerous. But no longer catastrophic. He exhaled once. Then he turned toward the stairwell. "Hey! Up here!" someone shouted from below. A flashlight beam jerked wildly in the blackness. "We can't get the gate open. Something's jammed." Mike started down the steps, 2 at a time. Flashlight out front. His boots landed solid. He passed the landing where water was pooling from a leak in the wall seam. Another cut corner. Another mess waiting to happen. As he reached the group 4 vendors, 2 teenagers, and an elderly usher clutching a railing, he saw the problem instantly. The emergency gate had dropped halfway. The power failure had triggered a safety lock, but the manual override was hidden behind a panel no one here would know existed. "We're stuck up here," the older man cried. "The elevators are out, and someone twisted their ankle trying to go down the south stairs." "We're gonna help you down," Mike said calmly. "Nobody's getting hurt tonight, I promise." One of the teenagers recognized him. "Hey, you're the janitor, right?" Mike didn't waste breath correcting the title. He moved to the half-fallen gate, ran his fingers along the metal edge, found the seam, and jammed his flathead screwdriver into it. With a twist, the cover popped open, revealing the manual crank. "All right," he said. "Everyone back up. When this gate goes up, we move slow. No pushing, no running. We go row by row. We can't wait." One of the vendors cried. We heard more people coming up behind us. Something about smoke near Section K. Mike's blood went cold. Smoke, near a stair tower, combined with flickering power and stuck exits. He'd spent years studying how disasters began, not with one catastrophic failure, but a chain of small ones linking together at the worst possible moment. And here they were colliding like dominoes. The old fear nipped at him, the fear born years ago in a courtroom when lawyers twisted his warnings into negligence. But he forced the memory back. People needed him, right now. He grabbed the crank, braced his legs, and turned with everything he had. The gate screeched and lifted inch by inch. The storm wailed outside. The stairwell shuddered with thunder. As the gate clicked into its open position, he turned to the group. "All right, let's move." He positioned himself at the front, guiding each person down the narrow stairs with his flashlight leading the way. He checked every railing before anyone put weight on it, every puddle before a foot stepped through. He became the evacuation plan his old company had ignored, the one Bryce pretended to invent. They reached the next level down when another tremor rolled through the stadium. The lights flickered once, twice, then glowed a faint emergency red. Somewhere above, something large crashed. Dust rained from the ceiling tiles. A voice cracked over a walkie-talkie in someone's hand. "We've got a smoke alarm triggered in the concessions hall." "Repeat, smoke," confirmed. Mike froze. The West Concourse connected directly to that hall. He turned back to the group, now huddled together in growing panic. "There's another stairwell 20 yards from here," he said. "I'll get you to it." "We'll never make it," one of the teenagers shouted. "You saw how dark it is. I'll get you there," Mike repeated. "Stick close." He led them into the long hallway flashlight bouncing off the trembling walls. Rain drummed against the exterior panels like fists. The emergency lights flickered again, threatening to die altogether. They were halfway through when they heard a swell of voices. Then the unmistakable sound of people running. A crowd flooded into view at the far end of the corridor. Security jackets. Fans who had taken shelter. Vendors. A crush of bodies with one exit behind them, the narrow stairwell Mike was leading to. If both groups collided here, someone would get trampled. "Hold up!" Mike shouted, raising his arms. "Stop! Stop right there!" A few people slowed. Others didn't. He stepped forward, planting himself in the center of the corridor like a boulder in a river. "Stop moving!" he roared. Something in his voice, authority, certainty, command, cut through the panic. The first few froze, then the ones behind them. Then the entire crowd halted like a wave hitting a seawall. "You can't go down that stairwell yet," Mike said. "It's too narrow. We'll do this in groups. You'll all get out, we just have to work together." People murmured anxiously. A mother held her daughter tighter. The elderly usher, Mike, had helped earlier, leaned against the wall, shaking. From behind, one of the vendors whispered, "How does he know all this?" Mike heard it, but didn't answer. He pointed to a security guard near the front of the larger group. "You," he said. "Take 10 people. Follow me. Keep your hands on the shoulders in front of you. When I say stop, you stop." The guard hesitated. "Who are you to be giving orders?" Mike met his eyes. "I'm the only one in this hall who knows how to get these people out safely." Something in the guard's expression shifted. Recognition, respect. Maybe both. He nodded. The first group followed Mike to the stairwell. He made sure they descended slowly, staggered, controlled. He returned for the next group, then the next. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the lights again. Finally, only a handful remained, the elderly usher, the teenagers, the mother and her daughter. "All right," Mike said softly. "You're up." The little girl clutched a stuffed baseball bear to her chest, tears streaking her face. Mike knelt in front of her, holding his flashlight so the warm glow touched her cheeks. "You're gonna be okay," he said. "I promise. I'm right behind you." She swallowed, and nodded. As they neared the stairwell, the red emergency lights snapped off this time for good. Pure darkness swallowed the hall. The girl whimpered. Mike lifted her into his arms before she could fall apart. The mother followed, gripping the railing with a trembling hand. He guided them step by step down the pitch-black tower, each movement deliberate, steady. Rain pounded the exterior wall, like the stadium itself was shaking apart. Halfway down, they heard a new sound shouting below. Voices, lights, flashlights. Here. Over here. Operations staff and security stormed into the stairwell from the lower level. One of them lifted a lantern. When the beam fell on Mike, carrying the girl leading the handful of remaining evacuees, every expression in the crowd changed. Shock. Relief. Recognition. "You," one supervisor whispered. "You got them down from the tower." Mike didn't answer. He set the girl down gently next to her mother. She threw her arms around him before running back to her mom. People stared like they were seeing him for the first time. A head of security pushed forward, rain dripping from his jacket. "Lawson," he said slowly, "how the hell did you know what to do up there?" Mike wiped water from his face. "Because I've spent half my life studying what happens when places like this go wrong." Suddenly, a new voice cut through the crowd. Mike Bryce stood at the edge of the lantern light, soaked, pale, and wide-eyed. He looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost walk out of a burning building. "You led the evacuation?" Bryce asked, stunned. You handled the tower." The words struggled out of him. "You saved them." Mike didn't move, didn't nod, didn't bask. He just breathed. The mother with the little girl stepped forward. "This man," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude, "saved our lives." The usher wiped tears from his eyes. "He saved all of us." A murmur rippled through the group, respect, awe, something close to devotion. The power dynamic in the hall shifted like a tectonic plate. Bryce swallowed hard. Security guards and supervisors now stood behind Mike instead of beside him. Someone handed him a blanket. Someone else offered a bottle of water. The girl waved at him with her stuffed bear. And for the first time in years, Mike felt something he'd forgotten. Not pride, not vindication, but purpose. People were alive because he'd stepped up, because he'd dared to act. And the night wasn't over yet. The crisis wasn't done. Lightning lit the stairwell again, revealing something behind Bryce, something swirling down the hallway like smoke. Real smoke, thick, heavy, moving fast. Mike's jaw tightened. This was only the beginning. And everyone was finally looking at him for what he truly was. For several long seconds, no one moved. The stairwell hummed with the breath of terrified people, the metallic drumming of rain against the exterior wall, and the faint hiss of smoke pushing under the emergency door. Lantern beams wavered as hands trembled. Every eye stayed locked on Mike, 39 years old, drenched, scraped, shaking only from adrenaline, not fear. The head of security stepped forward, face pale. "Lawson, what you just did." His voice faltered, emotion catching somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. "I've never seen a civilian, heck even half my team, handle a blackout evac like that." A vendor wiped tears from her face. "You were the only one who acted like you knew what was happening." The little girl clutched her stuffed bear tight, her eyes wide with something like hero worship. Her mother whispered, "He saved us like it was a prayer." Even the guards, the ushers, the younger workers who'd barely noticed him before, stared at him with an expression he hadn't seen in years, respect, born from survival. But Bryce, standing halfway down the hall, still looked like someone trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. Rainwater plastered his hair to his forehead. His hands shook as he held his radio, as if waiting for anyone to tell him this wasn't happening. The smoke thickened near the far end of the corridor, swirling into the emergency lights that flickered back to life in dull red glows. Somewhere deeper in the stadium, alarms finally caught up, wailing through the tunnels. Security began guiding the evacuees toward the safe zones. A paramedic checked the injured teenager. The crowd thinned, but eyes lingered on Mike, like they weren't ready to let go of the man who'd pulled them out of the dark. The last to approach him was the elderly usher, a man with thinning gray hair and shaking hands. He took Mike's arm with a kind of reverence. "Son," he whispered, voice hoarse, "you saved my life. I didn't think I'd see another sunrise." Mike nodded, unable to trust his own voice. And then, for the first time in years, someone asked a question no one had dared ask. "Who are you?" Another voice echoed it. Then another. Their confusion wasn't suspicion. It was awe. The kind that comes when people realize the person they dismissed was carrying a weight far bigger than anyone knew. Mike opened his mouth, answered only, "Just someone who knew what needed doing." But the truth hovered in the air like its own kind of smoke, visible rising, waiting to escape. A shout cut through the moment. "We've got more smoke coming in," a security guard yelled from the far end of the hall. "Concourse overflow's jammed. People are backing up at the ramps." Lightning flashed white across the narrow windows. The power gave another worrying flicker. "With systems unstable, the guard said we could lose the generators. If that happens, the entire upper bowl becomes a maze. Blind corners, dead communications, panic spiraling." Bryce stepped toward Mike, breath unsteady. "Lawson, what should we do?" The question stunned the hall. The man who had treated him like a stray tool now looked at him like a lifeline. Mike blinked rain out of his eyes. "We need to redirect the crowd," he said. "South ramp's safer, least amount of electrical damage. And we need to control the flow before panic spreads. That's not the current evacuation protocol the head of security started. Your current protocol assumes the emergency lines are isolated." Mike cut in. "They're not. That panel upstairs is wet. Something's routed wrong." The guard stared. "How do you know that?" Because he'd seen it. Because he'd predicted it years before anyone thought him worth listening to. Because this was not the first time he'd watched a building become a trap, while people in suits ignored warnings until it was almost too late. Mike swallowed hard. The truth pressed against his ribs. He had spent a decade hiding from the shadow cast by one catastrophic case, one partner's lie that wrecked his reputation. But tonight, standing in a half-lit stairwell with lives in the balance, he wasn't the man who fled that past. He was the man who survived it. And maybe these people needed to hear the truth. Maybe he needed to hear himself say it. "Listen," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "This stadium wasn't built with the right fail-safes for a storm like this. The emergency grid's wired wrong. I know because..." He steadied himself. "Because I wrote the original safety framework this place copied." Heads turned. Security lifted their lanterns higher. Even the smoke seemed to pause. What Bryce breathed barely audible. Mike exhaled. "Before I ended up with a mop in my hand, I was a fire protection engineer. 10 years ago, I designed evacuation models for structures a lot like this one. I warned the company I worked for what happens when you cut corners on emergency lines." His voice roughened. No one listened. And when the worst happened, the person who ignored those warnings blamed me to save his own skin. Silence hit like a dropped weight. The head of security blinked. "Wait," "You're that Lawson, the one from the Meridian Collapse Review." A cold shiver rippled through the hall. Everyone in stadium operations knew the Meridian case, the collapsed bleacher system during an off-season event, the company scandal, the licensing fight. Mike had refused to sign off on a shortcut that later proved catastrophic, and yet he'd taken the fall when lawyers rearranged the narrative. Bryce's mouth fell open. I thought that guy... He stopped staring at Mike as realization washed over him. "You're the engineer I built the rush flow presentation off of..." The words tasted rotten in the air. Mike didn't respond. He wasn't angry, just tired. The head of security stepped forward, jaw tight. "If he wrote the original safety model, we follow his lead, now." A shift, subtle but seismic, rippled through the group. The guards straightened. Supervisors nodded. Workers who'd ignored Mike before now looked at him the way soldiers look at a commander in a firefight. Bryce's face twisted with something complicated: fear, regret, maybe shame. "Lawson, I didn't know. I swear. I thought you were just the janitor," Mike said plainly. Bryce flinched. The mother of the little girl stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I don't care what he used to be called. This man saved my daughter's life. If he says move south, we move south." The crowd murmured agreement. The power dynamic wasn't shifting anymore. It had already shifted. This was a man they trusted more than the suits, the protocols, or the printed handbooks. Mike turned toward the smoke-clouded corridor. "We need to route everyone down the south ramp and get the power crew offline from the west feeds. If we lose the generators while they're still crowding, people could get crushed." Security snapped into motion. Workers and ushers coordinated with hurried nods. Radios buzzed with new instructions, ones that carried Mike's directives, not Bryce's. Bryce looked dazed. "You took charge like you never left the job." Mike gave a short, humorless breath. "I never stopped knowing how." A distant rumble signaled another system failure, this time somewhere near the concourse. The lights flickered again. One of the guards cursed under his breath. "We don't have much time," Mike said. "If the fans hear alarms without direction, they're going to panic. We need to get eyes on the south ramps now." The head of security nodded sharply. "I'll lead the ground crew. Lawson, you run command with us." For a moment, one fragile moment, Mike felt the old instinct to refuse, to shrink back to the shadows where no one expected anything from him. But then he thought of Emma's face when she asked why he let people treat him like he was less. He wasn't less. He never had been. And hiding from who he used to be wasn't protecting her. It was teaching her to shrink too. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll run command." They moved together down the hall, a strange procession of soaked workers, shaken evacuees, and a humbled vice president trailing behind like a child who'd touched a hot stove and finally believed it burned. As they reached the operations tunnel, the stadium roared above them, uncertain, scared, restless. The power flickered again. Smoke alarms echoed from multiple sections. Radios crackled with overlapping messages. But when Mike stepped into the control hub, a glass-walled room full of monitors, maps, and jittery personnel, the chaos paused just long enough for all eyes to turn to him. He didn't need introductions. Word had already moved faster than the alarms. Lawson, one operator, whispered, "You're the engineer, right?" Mike nodded. "Let's get this place under control." He walked to the main display, an overhead schematic of the bowl concourse and ramps. The screens flickered, but the layouts remained clear. "All right," he said, voice steady. "We'll split into 3 teams, one guiding fans toward the south ramp, one clearing blockages on the main concourse, and one securing all the electrical access points until we know which grid is compromised." Everyone leaned closer. They listened. Really listened. Even Bryce in the back of the room looked at Mike like he'd never seen him before, not as a name tag, a job title, or a forgotten resume tucked under years of dust, but as the architect of the very safety systems he'd leaned on without understanding. For the first time in years, Mike felt the weight of his old life return, not as a burden, but as strength. The training, the instinct, the purpose, the man he used to be wasn't gone. He'd been waiting. "Let's move," Mike said. Operators relayed instructions. Security mobilized. The stadium began shifting like a great machine under expert hands, his hands. And just as the smoke alarms began to wail louder, a new voice crackled over the radio. "Operations, be advised, we've got water pooling near the electrical junction under section 112. If that shorts, we could lose the whole lower bowl." Mike's jaw tightened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the room around him, the people who had once dismissed him, stood ready to follow. Because now they knew who he really was. And the next decision he made would shape everything that happened next. The shift inside the operations hub happened fast and quiet, like a tide turning. Technicians who had barely nodded at Mike before now leaned in for his instructions. Security relayed his commands without hesitation. Even the scoreboard crew called down to confirm they should display evacuation messages per Lawson's direction. The storm raged outside, but inside that glass room something steadier took root. People trusted him. People saw him. And for the first time in years, no one questioned whether he belonged. On the far wall, Bryce stood alone, soaked and shaken, his clipboard hanging limp at his side. He didn't bark orders. He didn't strut. He watched the monitors with the quiet dread of someone finally understanding the cost of cutting corners. When Mike finished assigning the last team, Bryce approached cautiously, like a man stepping toward a truth he'd avoided for too long. "I owe you an apology," he said, voice rough. "I treated you like you were nothing, and tonight you saved every one of us." Mike didn't soften. The apology wasn't for him to make easier. Bryce lowered his head. "And the system, the one I took credit for," his voice cracked. "I never knew where it came from." "You know now," Mike said simply. Before Bryce could answer, the head of security rushed in. "South ramp's clear. Fans are moving. No injuries reported." Then he turned to Mike with a grin that carried pure relief. "We've got this stabilized, thanks to you." For the next hour, Mike stayed in command as the crowd flowed safely out of the stadium. Emergency teams confirmed the electrical issues were contained. The smoke resolved into a minor concession fire, quickly extinguished. By midnight, Riverfront Field stood mostly empty, drenched but intact. Only then did Mike step outside into the rain-cooled air, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet light in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. The little girl he'd carried down the stairs ran to him from the plaza walkway, her stuffed bear bouncing in her arm. "Mom says you're a real hero," she announced. He managed a tired smile. "I'm just glad you're safe." She squeezed his hand once before her mother whisked her away. And that small gesture, the trust of a child, was the first moment Mike felt the edges of something he thought he'd lost, the belief that he still had something to give. 2 days later, he was summoned to the main conference room, the same room where executives once asked him to avoid tripping over their guests. Now the owners, heads of operations, city officials, and emergency managers filled the long table. Cameras were set up along the wall. Reporters waited in the lobby. Mike walked in wearing clean jeans and his faded Riverfront polo. He didn't try to look like anything more. The head of security stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who prevented a major stadium disaster." Applause rose, genuine and sustained. Bryce followed, no swagger left. Tonight's review verified exactly what Lawson warned us about: faulty routing, bad wiring decisions, and a copycat evacuation model we didn't fully understand. He swallowed hard. As of this morning, I've stepped down. Whispers rustled through the room. Then the head of operations turned to Mike. We'd like to offer you a position, Senior Director of Safety and Infrastructure. Full authority over emergency planning, structural reviews, and evacuation protocols. You'd be rebuilding this stadium the way it should have been built in the first place. Mike stared at the contract on the table. His name, Michael Lawson, printed in bold letters beside a salary he hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. He didn't reach for it immediately, because something else mattered more. Before I answer, he said quietly, I want one thing clear. You're hiring me because of what I know, not just because of what happened last night. I won't sign on as decoration. The city official nodded. That's why we want you. Mike glanced at the windows overlooking the field. Rain clouds were finally breaking, letting in morning light. He thought of Emma, of the look in her eyes when she asked why he let people treat him like he was less. Maybe it was time to show her what it looked like when someone stood back up. He picked up the pen. I'm in. 6 months passed. Riverfront Field didn't look the same anymore. New flood barriers, reinforced emergency lighting, widened stair towers, a full overhaul of the electrical grid. And in the operations hub, the room once ruled by egos and protocols, Mike's diagrams hung framed on the wall, hand-signed by every worker who helped rebuild the system. Mike didn't become a suit. He still wore work boots, still walked the concourse before every game, still carried the same old flashlight he'd used in the blackout. But now, when people passed him, they stopped to shake his hand. Parents pointed him out to their kids. See that man? He's why this place is safe. And some nights when the stadium emptied and the lights dimmed, Emma would come sit with him in the stands. She was taller now, surer of herself, proud of him, in a way she didn't have to say aloud. You look happier, she told him once. I am, he'd said, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't hiding from who he used to be. He had taken something broken, his past, this stadium, and turned it into something stronger, something people could trust. And as the summer sun set over Pittsburgh and the evening breeze lifted the flags above the field, Mike Lawson sat quietly in the stands he helped protect, listening to the cooling metal creak like a building settling into peace. Sometimes life gives you the chance to reclaim the part of yourself that got buried. And if you're brave enough to take it, you just might find the world is willing to meet you halfway.